Hey everybody, I'm Amanda with DevExpress, and welcome to today's webinar, DevExpress ASP.NET MVC Unobtrusive Validation. In this session, Web Program Manager Mehul Harry and Technical Evangelist Don Wibier will tell you all about validating user input to make sure you get what you expect. See the differences between obtrusive versus unobtrusive validation, and why the latter is best suited to the MVC design pattern. Through live coding, see how to apply this type of validation to the DevExpress Grid View MVC extension, as well as the editor extensions. Thank you for joining us. I will now hand things over to Mehul and Don.
Good morning, welcome everyone. Today we're going to talk about a feature about ASP.NET MVC framework called Unobtrusive Validation. I am Mehul Harry, and joining me is Don Wibier, and we work a lot with our ASP.NET products. And we get questions about unobtrusive validation and so forth. So today I want to kind of address this feature from the framework and the DevExpress MVC controls as well. So the agenda is really simple. Today I will be talking about the validation feature, how it fits into the framework, its history, and define what obtrusive means. And then Don's going to show us 3 technical demos. First, he's going to use the Microsoft ASP.NET MVC approach to really show how this feature works with a model, how its benefits, and why it's so useful and interesting. And then he's going to show us the DevExpress ASP.NET MVC approach and how it builds on top of the standard ASP.NET MVC approach from Microsoft. And finally, we've got a real short web forms demo, and that's not necessarily specific to unobtrusive, but it is specific to validation, because the key for this whole webinar really was about validation. Don, for this past 6 months or so, has been blogging quite a bit about the OWASP features, which is the top security features that you should be handling for your websites. And so validation has been an important topic that we should all be addressing in our websites. All right, so let's get started. First of all, let's just quickly define, why is validation important? Well, quite simply, it helps us to secure our application and make sure the data that we receive is correct, with the key goal being that we ensure that the application is robust against all forms of input data. We want to make sure that we are not only getting accurate data, but we are not getting any malicious data that could harm our backend, because sure enough, if it's out there on the web, there is a malicious user out there looking to see how something can be hacked, even if it's just for the sake of figuring out, oh, I found a hack in the system. So you want to be aware that absolutely your website is a surface for possible attacks. So here's a great cartoon from XKCD that kind of explains it, and check it out while I explain some of these reasonings. Now, we ourselves at DevExpress, we've seen plenty where people have reported to us that said, hey, listen, we're in this environment, we found something interesting, and as you may have noticed, we are on top of it. We'll send out a notice saying, hey, we found something, and we'll fix it the next day. But more importantly, you have probably heard of the larger things out there for major corporate websites, for credit card networks that get hacked, and all of a sudden a bunch of user data is exposed, all from simple things like not sanitizing inputs and things like that. So it's really an important topic to make sure that is on your mind, and something we take for granted. Now, DevExpress does a lot to bring you those features baked in, but this feature today we'll be talking about, I believe, is something that is a great MVC feature that we should all be taking advantage of. So there are 2 types of validation. We have client-side and server-side, and let's talk a little bit about some of the advantages and disadvantages between the 2. So client-side validation is performed on the client's browser and allows you to immediately show or hide error messages according to the user input validity. Now, the client-side validation validates the form before it is submitted. If the form is not valid, it won't be submitted. Now, the advantages of this approach means that it's faster. You give a better experience to the end user because it all happens on the client side. Nothing is submitted to the server until the whole form is submitted using the submit button. Now, and it's faster because you're not using any round trips to the server. The big drawback, however, is that it is very risky because the end user can tamper with it. And not only can they tamper with it, you don't even know if it is an end user. Perhaps it is just a robot out there that is looking at HTTP endpoints and seeing different ways that they may be able to submit some data and find some way to take over your system. So it's really a system where it has some really nice user experience features, but a high risk endpoint for exposing your system if your validation is only on the client side. So what about the server side? Well, the server side is great because it occurs, well, first of all, it occurs when the form is submitted to the server. And the server-side validation allows you to protect your web application from malicious end users who can bypass the client-side validation. So we know the big downside is that extra round trip versus the client side, meaning that you have to send all the information to the server before it can be validated. However, there's key advantages in this approach, meaning that this is your final security checkpoint. This is the last stand before data is then forwarded on to your backend, your middle tier, wherever it needs to go. This is your last chance to say, hey, data, who are you? Let me take a look. Are you okay? Yes, no, and then send it forward. So, and then we can also do integrity checks. We ensure that the data has not been tampered with and is the same as before. So we can say that the data is strongly typed, has correct syntax, is within length boundaries, contains only permitted characters, or that the numbers are correctly signed and within range boundaries. And it also gives us a chance to apply any business rules. So, say for example, we have interest rates that fall within permitted boundaries. Well, we can verify that using our business rules on the server side, but it's not something I would want to expose that on the client side, because let's say the range is within 5 to 10%, and then somebody says, no, on a loan, I'm just going to make this 1%. So you don't want to naturally expose that, and that's because it can also be a key competitive advantage for your business rule. So the question then becomes is, we have some great user experience, and we all know a better user experience makes our websites more attractive to the end users. They tend to use it more. We get better feedback. But the server-side validation is key. So what should you use? Well, the answer is both have their advantages and disadvantages, but clearly you have to use both. Because server-side is your last stand, server-side should absolutely be a key factor. And there's another reason why you should actually always use server-side validation, and that is because client-side, even if you are using it, cannot always be guaranteed, because client-side, its main drawback is that it relies on JavaScript, and we'll talk about how Unobtrusive is essentially a very JavaScript-reliant feature. And if perhaps your end users don't have JavaScript enabled in the browser, well, naturally your client-side validation is not going to work at all. In that case, that's where your server-side validation is going to be your backup. All right, so let's talk about Unobtrusive. What is Unobtrusive? In the simplest sense, anything obtrusive essentially means that it intrudes. It gets in the way of. And Unobtrusive, I don't think it's a really great name per se, but what it really means is, well, let's first define what it looks like. When you have a form, so let's say we had some MVC extensions, some standard ones, some DevExpress ones, they all emit this nice HTML5 tags. So we have some labels, we have some inputs. Now, when we will need to validate this on the client side, what you would do is you would write some JavaScript that says, hey, listen, this input, etc., I'm going to check you for length or type or so forth. So what does that look like? Well, it looks like this. And this is what would be inserted into your view, and essentially every view would have a set of these items. So what Unobtrusive essentially means, and I'm not going to get too deep into this, Don in his first demo is going to explain this much better, how it bubbles up from the model and all that good stuff, is that we're going to take this and say, you know what, MVC is all about being separation of concerns. I want my views clean. So to be unobtrusive, they say rather than take all of this JavaScript, put this JavaScript in a separate file. That's my concern. It should be in its own script files, and leave my view nice and HTML5 clean. So what they do instead is they take the standard HTML and add extra tags on there. So using these extra tags, they're now able to remove that JavaScript. So now it's unobtrusive, and that's what unobtrusive JavaScript unobtrusive client-side validation essentially means. All right. So now let me talk a little bit about the history before Don gets into the demos. First of all, it was introduced in ASP.NET MVC2. Well, in ASP.NET MVC2, actually, Microsoft wrote their own JavaScript for client-side validation. But what they found was, at that time, jQuery was getting very popular. And a lot of the MVC developers and users out there, they said, well, really, you know, jQuery is the thing I am most interested in. So what they said was, well, let's bring it in and into something what they call their Futures project. Now, Futures is their test bench for the next version of the framework. So anytime they release the current version, they're already working on the Futures version, which is the next version, the beta version. And in there, in MVC3 beta, they started introducing jQuery and jQuery client-side validation. So, because they realized, you know, we don't want to be in the business of rewriting something, especially something that's as popular as jQuery. They said, why are we going to compete with jQuery? So rather, they said, we're going to stop working on the client-side stuff that we've been working on, and instead, you can start using that. So in MVC3 is really when you saw jQuery and unobtrusive client-side validation with jQuery. Now, unfortunately, though, while it was introduced, you still had to enable it. You had to go into web config. You had to set a couple of settings, which I'll show you in a second. But what they quickly realized is as soon as MVC3 came out, everybody just started saying, yeah, this is great. We should be using this. Why are we not using this? And so by MVC4, they essentially just made it default, meaning it's on. You don't even have to muck with it. So with MVC4 and beyond, it is now enabled by default. So what does it look like? Well, in web config, under the configuration app settings, you'll find a couple of keys. Client-side validation enabled. When it's set to true, that means that client-side validation is going to emit that JavaScript and it'll be into the view. Now, when you set the unobtrusive JavaScript enabled, it's then going to keep your view clean. So this is both on by default, and I recommend using this. The good news is you can control whether this is local or global. Now, this web config setting, if it's in the web config or if it's in the global ASAX file, means that it's global to the application. However, you can control it by adding these HTML helper methods into a view or controller, which will then define per view and controller. Now, if you have specific reasons to do this, you can do this. However, I recommend that you keep it enabled for the entire application. And finally, let me talk a little bit about dependencies. The unobtrusive client-side validation feature requires jQuery. Specifically, it requires 3 jQuery files. Now, I've chosen the version that I've got right now on my Visual Studio, which is, it requires the base jQuery file, which is 1.10.2 currently, but I recommend using the latest stable version. And then it also requires the jQuery validate files. So, and then on top of that, it requires the MVC plugin for the jQuery validation, which is the jQuery validate unobtrusive. So these 3 are available as NuGet packages, or you can download from the jQuery site. The good news is the DevExpress templates and the Microsoft standard project templates both provide these files for you that you can easily get started with. All right. One last thing, as I mentioned before, because jQuery essentially is JavaScript, this requires your end users to have the capability to run JavaScript, which means if perhaps they're in a corporate environment where there are, you know, perhaps blocking certain types of script files, or they themselves have not enabled script files, If JavaScript is not enabled in the browser, then unfortunately, client-side validation, like much of the website features, will not work. The good news is JavaScript is so prevalent these days that it's highly unlikely that this might happen. But if it does, I would suspect, first of all, check whether or not they have client-side JavaScript enabled in the browser. All right, with that, I'm going to hand it over to Don, who's going to show us a few of those demos. Take it away, Don.
Hey, welcome. Let me get the screen from Mahul. All right, so I'm going to show you a couple of demos to show the differences between the obtrusive versus unobtrusive validation, the stuff that Mahul has been talking about. And what I've done here, I've set up an empty project and I have used the DevExpress template gallery for that. I can show you how to do that. So let me say a new project, and I will not finish the wizard, but I've prepared just some minor details here. And I can go to Web and double-click the template gallery here, and that will show the wizard where I have selected the ASP.NET MVC empty web application. So I will cancel this one because I've set up a database and some stuff. So for the rest, this application is completely empty. It doesn't have any models. It doesn't have any controllers. It does have the scripts that Mahul was mentioning, and they're being delivered by our project template. As you can see, I have the jQuery unobtrusive, and I've got the jQuery itself and the jQuery validate file. So that's all what's needed for this validation method. So before we can validate anything, we need to set up a small model, and that's what I'm going to do. I'm going to create just a really tiny application which allows me to view and modify my customers. And that's done by adding a new model. And that's going to be my customer model. And this customer model is just a regular C# class. It's not derived from anything, and I will add a couple of properties here. I will be using the entity framework for data access. So everybody who is familiar with the entity framework knows that we can just add the properties. Let me put the set as well. And let me put in a couple of other fields. I'm not going to make it too difficult, but it is just to give you a good impression on how this stuff works. So my customer has a first name, a middle name, a last name, and an email address. Well, there are a couple of things that I wanna validate, server side as well as client side. And these things can be validated client side as well, because a first name should be filled in, a last name should also be filled in, and an email address should also be required. And an email address has a certain pattern, which can be tested with a regular expression. But I'll talk about it in a second. Before we can use this customer model, I will also need to set up a small DB context class, and for that I will put in some code. It can be generated by Visual Studio as well, but I will just do it like this. Let me quickly resolve the required namespaces, and this will basically mean that it will get my web config setting default connection, and that will be used for the connection string, and it will return a DB set of customers, and the entity framework will take care that stuff will be stored and loaded, etc., etc. So these are basically the two things that we need. And yeah, what you should do is you should move this in a separate file, which is a bit more readable, but fortunately I can use my code Rust extension to just say move this type to a file, and I've got it in the file. Let me do a quick build. So the next step can be done from within Visual Studio. Because what I'm doing now is I'm going to add a controller, which is going to be my home controller. And this home controller, I will select the scaffolding options. So I will just use the entity framework with read-write actions and views. So that saves me some typing work. I can now select a model class, which will be the customer, and the data context class is the one that I just created. Let me check a couple of minor details. This is all okay. All right. So basically, when the wizard has finished, I can run the application, and you will see that we can do updates, insert, deletes, and selects on my customer table. Well, this is just a standard MVC wizard approach. So let it give a couple of seconds to finish off, and there we are. So as you can see, I've got the index razor file, which will do the list of customers. I've got the edit one. Well, this is all fairly standard MVC work, I'd say. But for the guys and girls who haven't seen this before, yeah, this is saving you quite some work. Anyway, I will first show you how the obtrusive validation works, and that is done by first, before I forget, as Mehul was mentioning, we have this unobtrusive JavaScript enabled, and it defaults to true. So I will turn that to false. So that's being done. And now I'm going to put the validation to work. And for that, I will switch back to the model. And I will say what I was mentioning before, the first name should be a required field. So how can I enforce that on this model? I can add an attribute which is named required. And once I have resolved the appropriate namespace, which is the system component model.data annotations, you'll see that it turns green, which is okay. And I also want the last name to be required. And this is a really cool feature of the MVC platform, because because of these attributes, let me do it on the email address as well. By specifying these attributes on these properties, the MVC framework will take care that this bubbles up all the way to the client in JavaScript, and that indeed those fields are being checked client-side as well as server-side. And how that's being checked on the server, I'll show you in a minute after I've shown you the client portion of it. There was one other thing that I wanted to check, because that email has can be tested with a regular expression. So let me add another attribute on this field. And that's going to be a regular expression attribute. And that attribute requires one parameter, and that parameter will be the regular expression to test the input against. So I know I should, but unfortunately I don't know the regular expression out of my head. But here it is. This is the regular expression for an email address. So now I've put some validation in place, and I placed it on the C# model. So let's see what happens when I build this. I'm going to start up the application, and yes, it is giving me a small error, and that is because I made a small change to my test application, and in this case the namespace is not right, which is a bit Let me open that as well. That's not going to happen. It should be this one. All right. So once the application has been started, you'll see quite an empty page because we didn't put in any data yet, except for obviously me and Mehul. And now we can edit, and you'll see that it is just giving me another error. And that is because we don't need this one. I used the DevExpress project template, and it renders slightly different as the Microsoft one, and I was checking the options when creating the controller and the views, and I should have unticked one of the boxes there, but that is quickly fixed. So let me run it one more time to see that everything is working now. And I will have my form here, and well, this one is filled in, so let me get back to the list and let me create a new one. If I now hit the create button with nothing filled in, it is not looking really beautiful, but you can see that the validation is in place. It is not displayed in red, but it is giving some validation. So let me show you what is being rendered with the obtrusive JavaScript. So remember, I put the web.config setting to false. This one, I put it to false. And if I switch to my PowerPoint slide, I have prepared it a bit for you so you can see it a bit more clear. This is basically the form that's being rendered. And as you can see, we have an input field which will give the input field for the first name, and it's got a span underneath it which will display the first name is required message if the validation fails. The middle name doesn't have anything because that was optional, and the last name has the same kind of information as the first name because it was required as well. And then last we have the email field, and that is also just an input type is text with the span underneath it, and okay, the validation message is a bit unreadable, but we can change that and I'll show you in a minute as well. What is more important is that the JavaScript which is put below this form, I've put it on a separate slide, is this. And this is the code that Mehul was showing you as well. And this code is being produced for every field in your form. And in this case, it is pretty readable, and I have structured it a bit. And as you can see, there is a field name, first name, and it specifies the validation rules, etc. So it's a JavaScript structure which is being built here. And the same goes for middle name. It doesn't have any validation rules. The last name is basically the same as the first name because it's got only one validation rule, which is the required one. And then the email is a bit more advanced because it basically has two validation rules. It is required, and it should also match the regular expression. But you can imagine that when you have a form which contains, I don't know, 100 editors, this JavaScript, which is rendered right below the form, I have actually shown the form close tag on top of this script block. But if you have a form which contains 100 controls, you'll have quite a bunch of JavaScript rendered inside your page. So that is basically what you don't want. Let me switch back to Visual Studio, And let me put this setting to true and show you the difference. Once I run the application again and I hit the create new link, it looks all the same, but when I hit create, it will still do the validation. So everything looks the same as it did before, but let me show you the source code which is being rendered. And also that Mahul was showing you just a little bit of it. What happens there is that we still have the form with all the input elements, but as you can see, there are a couple of HTML5 attributes included in those elements, like the data file required, and also in the span class which displays the validation text. There are some HTML5 attributes included. Same goes for the middle name, but it doesn't have any validation. Same goes for the last name and the email as well, and it's got a couple of extra attributes. And this is why they call it unobtrusive validation, because we are now not doing any JavaScript anymore. If I show you the second part of this form, then you'll see, well, actually this comment is not inserted, but I've inserted it for you. That whole block that you just saw on the previous slides, it's gone now. It's completely gone because the unobtrusive JavaScript validation from jQuery will check all the elements with the HTML5 elements inside. So if I go back, jQuery can check all those HTML5 attributes, and it can validate by just checking those items, because all the information that you need for the validation is in those attributes described. And that is why it is called unobtrusive validation. So let me switch back to Visual Studio, because I have shown you now standard MVC work with the standard Microsoft editors and the standard way of making a table in the index.chtml. This has nothing to do with DevExpress. What I'm going to show you now is I'm going to reconstruct those views, and I'm going to use DevExpress controls for it to show you that I will not put any validation logic inside the DevExpress controls, and you will see that it will just work even nicer and even better looking as the standard validation. So I will start with the create form. Here you'll see the form which I have been showing you in my Firefox. So this form. The reason, by the way, that these controls are looking slightly different is that I have already put one of the DevExpress standard themes in place in the web config, and that is the Moderno theme, and that has been specified in the settings below. You can pick any of our beautiful themes and your application looks just awesome. I've specified that here. There is also a menu item which also allows you to set it. It's with the ASP.NET controls. The update project allows you to change the theme. Let me get back to the view. I will just remove the field set, and let me move this button just outside the field set. I will show you another MVC extension from DevExpress, which is a really cool one, and it will save you quite an amount of work when creating forms. It is called our form layout control, and you can just insert it by using our MVC extension wizard. This wizard will hold all our MVC extensions, and it's grouped by tabs on top of this wizard. And what I need is located in the navigation and layout section, and it's called the form layout. And this extension will need a name, and you can specify a number of options like place items in a group, show group caption, etc., etc. For now, I don't want it, but you can experiment with it any way you like. I will get my model, which was the customer, and the wizard is able to retrieve all the properties, and you can specify which fields you want to edit. I want to have the first name, the middle name, the last name, and the email address. And let me hide. You can also specify help text if you like, and it's being nicely rendered underneath the control, or you can specify it in another position if you like. I will not use the help text, and I will show the item caption, obviously. Once I hit insert, we'll put some code on a number of places, but the most important code is already inserted here in the view, and this is iForm, and this form, let me see that everything is in there. Let me run it and show you the difference. So if I now go to create new, here is the form that we render with our form layout control. You'll see that in this case we have a couple of little asterisks put behind the fields which are required. Let me. Okay, I didn't start my zoom function. Let me get back to this one, but you'll see that these little asterisks, these indications are rendered by our form control, and this control already checks those attributes to see which fields are required. But before we can actually see the real validation, or when the validation fails, in this case nothing is going to happen. It's just going to focus on the first field that will fail validation. We need to specify a couple of things, because for everybody who is used to the web forms controls of DevExpress, you know that our editors, they have some great settings on how to display validation errors. And the same applies for this form layout, as well as the editor extensions that we are using. So what we basically want to do is we need to specify on each model, we need to specify a number of properties. And the most easy way of doing that is by inserting a method which will be executed for every control being rendered by the form layout. This action, what it does is it will get the settings of one of the form items, and in this case it will cast it to a text box settings object. And here we can specify the properties on the validation settings. Excuse me. Another very important issue that we need to set is show model errors. And this makes sure that those editors are checking the attributes that I have specified on my customer model. So this method should now be invoked when the form layout is being populated with controls. And fortunately, there is a second parameter on this method which will make sure that it happens. I can just specify that method. And now whenever this form layout is being rendered and populated with the controls, this method will make sure that all those validation display settings, so this is not like if it is required or whatever, but just if you want to have an icon, or if you want to have a red border around it, or well, all the specific validation features that DevExpress controls have, they will be set because of this method being executed. So if I run it again, and I go to create new and hit the create button, you will notice that we have this unobtrusive validation, and it is just working out of the box with our editors. And as said, I only needed to specify a couple of styling details on those editors, but the editors, they know if it is a required field. So if I specify something here and I do something there and I enter something here, it is still not valid, that email box, and that is because I just didn't include a valid email address. And now it's valid. So if I hit create, you'll see that's being inserted. So that is basically how simple it is to use this unobtrusive validation together with the DevExpress editors. Let me show you one other thing, and this table, well, it is a table, but it's not looking good, especially if you're using our DevExpress controls. So let me replace it with a grid view, and that will immediately show you one other strength of this model validation approach. So when I go to the index, I will just remove that entire table. And what I'll do now is I will insert another MVC extension from DevExpress. And that is going to be our famous grid view extension. Well, the grid view will be rendered in a partial view. You can specify that name here. It also needs the extension name, which should be unique in one page. But in this case, that's not a problem. And here I can specify the model binding properties. So I want to bind customers to this grid. And I have a DB context, and I want to have a couple of fields. As again, the fields are being populated design time already. And the key field will be the ID one. For the rest, I want to have a pager, I want to have grouping, filtering, selecting. When I hit insert, we'll create some code for you, which will save you quite some work. And well, where the table was is now a grid view partial being rendered in, and that grid view partial is in my project also added by the wizard, and it will make all the settings needed for the grid view. It will have the columns as well as specified. But nothing has been set here or specified or configured concerning validation or which fields are required, etc., etc. So let me run this. And once the grid has been rendered, you'll see a beautiful, nice looking grid. And it even has inline editing features. So if I just click this, I will get my first name. And I know one of our colleagues is also checking out this webinar. So I'm just going to put him in as my customer as well. And let me update it because this email address is not valid. And what you see here is that the regular expression attribute that was put on the customer model is bubbled up all the way into the DevExpress grid view, and it is valid. This validation rule applies for inline editing in our DevExpress grid as well. So I would say this is pretty cool. And this also immediately shows you the power of this kind of validation approach, because I have only specified it on one place. And if you would have this grid and you would have a separate page as well for updating, like what we are having, Yeah, if you wouldn't use this approach, you should have to set those validation constraints as well as in the grid column and in the editor on the other view. So this will save you quite an amount of work, and it will just work with our DevExpress editors like it was, yeah, like anything. So this is basically the power that we are also providing in all our controls. When I can also add a new one, and again when I hit update, it will validate immediately. And here, this also explains why I have put in that method, that action method on the, where is it? On my create view. If I go all the way to the top, I have changed the validation settings display mode to none, and I have set the error frame style also to another color. And if I didn't specify it, I would have the same kind of default validation indication as what you see here in the grid. So I could do the same on the grid as well to have like the red border in a similar way, because I can just set those validation properties. So that were my first two demos. Well, there are a couple of people, according to the poll, that are still doing web forms, and I do want to show you a really small web forms project. That's going to be my last demo. I have prepared another one because I do want to show you that our editors have absolute cool validation in any way, and that we can mimic similar user experiences. So what I've done here, I have created a web forms application with the project template from DevExpress, and instead of the MVC project, I have specified the web forms one. It's gonna have just an empty page because I've chosen the empty one as well. And what I will do here, I will drag in a form layout. This happens whenever you're not waiting for it. So here is my form layout. Yes, and yeah, with web forms you can just switch to design, and I'll show you the form layout for web forms and its designer, because the designer has quite a bit of more functionality as the MVC extension one. I mean, the form layout has the same functionality, but the design time experience for web forms is obviously pretty cool. So I can just insert a text box, and I can insert another text box, and I'll do the same form, and I'm going to do another text box, which is my last name, and I will need one for my email address. Let me specify the align item captions all the same. And also here you can clearly see the required mark. Remember the little green asterisks for the required fields? Well, you can specify another sign if you like. And that also is available for the MVC extension. So let me specify the caption here. And what you notice, I'm specifying those items now. You can specify it in the MVC extension as well, but we are taking those names also on the same way as that we check those attributes. So we make it first name, first space name, and middle space name. We do that for you automatically, but also for that there is an attribute in the MVC one. Let me do the last name and the email address. Well, the email address, you wonder how did I get that regular expression? That is really simple, because if I go to the properties And to the validation settings, there is a regular expression validation setting here. And here I can just specify that internet email address. This is the same expression. This one was going to be required. And also this one is going to be required. And I only need one extra thing, which is a button to do a post back. And let me get that button out of here and put it here. All right, and I will put some code in, which is also concerning validation. I will execute this method. It's a static method that we provide, and what this basically does is the server-side validation of the properties that we have specified in the editors inside that form. And that is an important thing. Let me see if my name also was form. I guess it was. No, it wasn't. Oh, that was my ASP.NET form, yeah. The form that it should validate was this one. So if I run this, it is giving me some error, and that's completely correct because I am writing a little status text so we can see that something has been going on the server. So for that to be visible, I should add a little label here. And that is going to be a server one, and the ID is going to be LBX status. Well, here we have our beautiful aligned form on web forms, and whenever I hit this button, you will see that validation takes place as well. There is one thing which didn't validate, and that's because I forgot a couple of properties on the email address. Probably if I didn't make it required. So if I enter an invalid pattern, you'll see that the expression failed. So I can just switch back and to design view, get my email one, and set the is required to true. And now I've got the same kind of behavior that I had for the MVC version as well. So this is basically what I wanted to show you about validation, and particularly the MVC one. Yeah, so Amanda, I hand it over to you. I don't know if there are any questions.
Hey Don, we did have a couple questions come in that Mehul has answered in the background. Thank you, Mehul. There was one question about a CodeRush shortcut a customer thought you were using to select a previously edited file. Do you know what they're referencing?
Yes, I have CodeRush installed, and I use it pretty much without even thinking about it. So I'm sorry, I can't recall. I don't know.
Okay. All right. Well, if you do have questions, now is the time to get them in while we're waiting. I will let you know next week our upcoming webinar is next Tuesday, February 17th, ASP.NET, Write Better JavaScript for Your App, presented by DevExpress CTO Julian Bucknell. Using the DX Hotels webinars, parts 1 and 2 as a starting point, Julian will show you how to write JavaScript within the context of your ASP.NET solution. No matter how you've structured your ASP.NET website, it's very likely that you will have to write some JavaScript for client-side event handlers, for interactions that don't need a round trip to the server, or for a myriad of other reasons. How you do so, following best practices, protecting your code and data, and minimizing your footprint on the global object will all be covered in this session. And again, it's next Tuesday, February 17th at 10 a.m. Pacific Standard Time. And as always, you can check out our webinars page for new and upcoming content at devexpress.com/webinars. All right, and if you would like to get in contact with Don or Mehul, Don has popped up his thank you slide, and there are their emails and their Twitter handles, so tweet away at them.
Yes, send me some.
Send him something.
By the way, so Michael had a question about conditional validation. I just wanted to add, Michael, Don's going to post a blog post after this, and we'll see about maybe doing a separate blog post just on conditional validation, because yeah, there's different approaches for that. I don't know if we'll make a whole webinar on it. A good webinar topic usually is more than, let's say, 15 minutes worth of content or something like that. So, but if we can make it real interesting, then absolutely we want to bring this to you guys. So, thank you, Amanda.
Awesome. All right, everybody. Again, this webinar will be available later on our DevExpress YouTube channel, and the link to our YouTube channel is posted in the chat box. And that is it for this one. Thank you so much to Don and Mehul. Thank you all for joining us, and of course, thank you for choosing DevExpress. Bye-bye.